Hello and greetings to our distinguished speakers and guests. My name is Johanna Pittman and I'm the CEO of Advance, the Global Australian Network. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Advance Global Town Hall focusing on research and commercialisation. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining you from today, the Darramuggle people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. With today's topic, it is particularly important to recognise and learn from the Indigenous people of Australia who have been innovating for many thousands of years. I extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be joining us today. And welcome to our global audience, from Melbourne to Minneapolis and Singapore to Switzerland. We are pleased but not surprised to see such far-reaching interest in today's topic. You will meet the speakers shortly and the presenters who contributed their perspectives via video interviews. It is a privilege to bring together these Australian innovators who are experts in taking research out of the lab and achieving real-world impact. Some of them you may know, some you will meet for the first time today. Together, they will help unpack how Australia can boost its track record of commercialising research. For those of you new to Advance, the Global Australian Network includes a range of backgrounds. So you might think about the Australians living overseas. You've also got those who have lived overseas, built their career overseas and returned home. We've also got the current and former international students studying in Australia, as well as recent and past migrants that have come to Australia. Each of these global Australians brings a global outlook based on the fact that their study and work has involved working across cultures and working in multiple very different environments. And it's this global outlook that we want to promote in these discussions. We've built this network for over 20 years with a goal to ensure the perspective of global Australians is heard by Australian decision makers and policy makers. Our endeavours have maintained bipartisan government support as well as sponsorship by Australian corporates and generous donors. At the heart of what we do is a belief in the positive soft power Australians can exert overseas and the immense benefits that Australia can gain from our global talent. Today, we explore what is happening when Australian research is ready to be taken to market, whatever market that may be. And we have asked each of our presenters to tell us about their experience with commercialising research and what suggestions they have that would support them and other entrepreneurs on the journey to success. Now, this global town hall is not just about our presenters, and we are seeking your questions and comments throughout the discussion. Thank you to those who submitted questions before this event, and thank you to all who have completed the first Slido poll. If you haven't had a chance to complete it yet, please do so on the right-hand side of the screen, or on your mobile device, you will see the polls option in the menu along the top of the screen. We are about to close the first poll and open the second. So today's discussion will kick off with remarks from each of the panel members. Then we will hear some other innovators we have interviewed, and we will reflect on the different perspectives with a panel discussion based on your pre-submitted questions and live questions from the Q&A section of the Slido screen. Our goal is to share some concrete actions and policy recommendations coming out of today's discussion, and thank you for making that possible. So to kick off, our first speaker today is Rupal Isman, Director of the Sydney Knowledge Hub at the University of Sydney. As you will hear, Rupal is an insider with an outsider's perspective, and she will set the scene on some of the key issues framing this discussion. Over to you, Rupal.
Thanks for inviting me. My name is Rupal Isman, as Joanna mentioned, and I'm calling from Gadigal land here in Sydney on the University of Sydney's campus. I'm, as opposed to the other speakers here, I'm more of a kind of ecosystem builder. So I'm going to tell a little bit of my story of kind of how I got into research commercialization and why it's important before I go into a couple of recommendations. So I am from Chicago. My folks are from India. My husband is Jewish. My daughter was born in New Zealand. My son was born in Sydney. So I feel like I'm really kind of a one-person global Australia network. We can go to the next slide. My career reflects, I guess, those adaptations that I've had to have as I restart myself across these different geographies, which essentially are different economies. All of my work has been in emerging industry. I first started my career in the mid-noughties in digital media, where I was really kind of learning how the internet worked. That brought me to Australia in 2007, and that kind of how to make money from the internet industry was booming, and I was able to take a little bit of risks in my career and launched an e-commerce startup in kind of the early days of the startup ecosystem called Andible back in 2010. Since then, I've been working in operations in very early stages of businesses, including as the general manager of Australia's first network of co-working spaces. I've worked in smart cities and GovTech in San Francisco, had a brief stint in New Zealand, and I moved back to Sydney in 2019, where I live and I call home now. And I work at the University of Sydney. And so what business do I have? This, startup generalist who's worked in a lot of different fields working at the University of Sydney. So when I was looking to kind of facilitate my role, to facilitate my move back to Australia, the startups that were getting a lot of attention and that were receiving funding were predominantly in fintech businesses and marketplaces. All the stuff that I was interested in, like climate tech and so forth, these were all kind of intellectual property heavy inventions and not just business model innovations. We can go to the next slide. So this data is a couple years old, but I think concisely tells this kind of problem. Australia has great universities. We do very well in basic research, but we do really poorly in terms of translation and commercialization. Who cares? What does it matter? So for me, that mattered back in 2019 because it was hard for me to find a job that I was excited about. I wasn't excited about marketplaces or fintech. No offense to those working in those areas. But it also means that the impact of one of Australia's biggest economic sectors could be much bigger if we invested more in, turning these research outcomes into real solutions for these really hard global problems. I think these have major implications for our economy. In terms of kind of moving away from, pulling things out of our earth and tourism and so forth. We could really have this robust economy heading in that I think we all kind of see in society. We could attract the smartest people and have some great jobs if we really took advantage of this. So moving on to the next slide, inaugural director of the Sydney Knowledge Hub, which is where I am now. It's an initiative out of the University of Sydney to support research commercialization. We can go to the next slide. We here help drive a culture of commercialization at the University of Sydney. We run a few programs for researchers. We make a lot of connections and guide researchers who want to pursue commercializations. We have a co-working space. So here we have 25 companies, very intellectual heavy, IP heavy companies that work here on the Darlington campus. And that's really helped that kind of ecosystem play for our researchers to be more exposed to, some of these businesses and inventions that are changing the world. We opened in 2019, and we are seeing a big leveling up across research organizations in Australia. University of Melbourne last year kind of announced a $100 million investment fund to invest in these early stage businesses coming from the university. University of New South Wales has a SynBio 10X accelerator program where Main Sequence Ventures, who is CSIRO's venture capital arm, is the major investment partner. So we're all kind of getting excited in this area, but I think we have a far way to go. So the next slide. So why does Australia lag behind in turning our research outputs into market-driven solutions? I think there's kind of four categories of reasons for this. The first one, that I think gets a lot of airtime is the Valley of Death, which is essentially the time when a researcher has invented something and they are working on kind of the product market fit. They might have had a diagnostic or a coding or something like that, but actually figuring out kind of where the market opportunity lies takes a bit of time. This period, of course, for intellectual property heavy inventions could be very long and is high risk. The science doesn't always work out. And Australia, I think, doesn't do a great job of hyping up these opportunities. And our capital here is not particularly patient. I think this is the most publicized problem, but I think this is partly an effect rather than a cause of some of the underlying issues. The second reason why I think Australia lags behind in terms of research commercialization is our levels of industry engagement. So our levels of businesses, a number of businesses, particularly SMEs collaborating with research organizations, is incredibly low. Germany, the UK have rates 8 to 10 times higher than Australia does. And then, there's all sorts of reasons for this, and this was kind of be a whole separate kind of webinar, but there's IP management issues, our networks are limited, there's different priorities, all these things. But we should be doing better because we see that the ROI on these collaborations are incredibly high. And Australia has really high, some of the best in the world, tax incentives to invest in, for companies to invest in research and development. The third reason I think that Australia could have better commercial outputs is because of the reward structures within Australian universities. Historically speaking, particularly a lot of amongst researchers, commercialization is often seen as kind of a dirty word or selling out. The frameworks for promotion within research organizations are around kind of attracting the most, ARC or NHMRC funding and publishing in, in prestigious journals, not around industry engagement and commercialization. So leadership on one hand says that we value it, but it's not necessarily matching the incentive structures that is at school and faculty level. And finally, I think we punch below our weight because, and I think this is, probably the biggest reason is because we have fewer people in our ecosystem. That means, a smaller market for products, which is, I think, part of the reason that we, our venture capital is not as excited about taking as much risk as, potentially, the US market, for example. But we also have fewer sources of inspirations and role models. And also, I think importantly, we have fewer commercialization leads. This topic is kind of near and dear to my heart. Our researchers want to be researchers. We need more kind of people with business acumen, more people who have experience in launching businesses to partner with our researchers to bring these inventions forward. So, but I think change is in the air. We have new demands on our rankings. We have new funding imperatives and opportunities like the Australian Economic Accelerator, which is $1.6 billion specifically from the federal government, specifically meant to address this. We have the National Reconstruction Fund, which is $15 billion in financing areas like defense and green energy and medicine, and new expectations from government and society. So I'm personally very excited to be working in this space because I think we're really at the beginnings of something quite transformational here in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupal, and thank you for that thorough overview. I think we'll hear many of those themes again and again today, and it will provide a really good context for our viewers, many of whom have been away from Australia for many years, and just being able to frame what's happening right now on the ground is incredibly helpful. So thank you, Rupal. Before I introduce our next speaker, please note the second Slido poll is open, and we're interested in who you think is taking leadership in the commercialisation of research in Australia. And with that, someone who has experienced commercialising their research in a very different market and highly successful at it. Our second speaker is Professor Richard Pestel, an Australian inspirational leader in the global cancer community. As a clinician, researcher, and entrepreneur, Richard is at the cutting edge of today's topic. And with that, look forward to hearing your perspective on this topic, Richard.
Joanna, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. And I wanted to also acknowledge the Seminole people upon whose land I stand today here in Florida. And I'm really grateful to you for fostering interest in this area of commercialization, of not only because it's a fundamental responsibility of academic institutions, but because there are opportunities to learn from a variety of different countries about how to do it better. As Jonah mentioned, I'm a medical oncologist by training, have been in various levels of medical administration, including working as the Executive Vice President at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital and system, and in that role had responsibilities for developing what was referred to as an innovation pillar. And perhaps some of those lessons could translate to the story here this evening. Next slide, please. So the key point I wanted to make on this slide is that Australia does very well in the international marketplace in a variety of different ventures, whether it comes to the news or business in a variety of different spaces. Australians succeed extremely well. If you compare the population of Florida and that of Australia, which are similar in size, it's remarkable, really, to me, the accomplishments of Australians. And I've listed some of the names and some of the companies that have been developed in the recent past. Next slide, please. One point on that last slide is the high ranking and status of the universities in Australia, which are a remarkable asset, which could be leveraged in a very substantial way because of the very high quality. This schematic is to represent the notion that you can have a seed of an idea and place it in the soil of a local ecosystem of a university, but there are gardeners who need to foster those relationships and foster the commercialization. And part of that is, very importantly, the federal government, and they're shown here. Next slide, please. This is a note for those who are interested in getting into the area of entrepreneurship. And this is a schematic representation of different personality types, a high risk, high reward, and a game of patience. But a variety of different personalities are seen amongst the successful entrepreneurs. So not all personalities need to be this particular entrepreneur type to succeed. Next slide, please. So this is a schematic of the type of internal challenges that exist within academic medical centres and within universities to facilitate commercialisation of inventions. I hope that the resolution is sufficient for people to see. The key point I wanted to make on this slide is that universities have a responsibility to the public to translate their discoveries to help the public. This is a fundamental tenet. So I think that a change in thinking about what universities are meant to do is a fundamental change that's important to promote commercialization. And universities have a responsibility to reduce the barrier to commercialization by facilitating and allowing faculty to hand off their ideas for commercialization. Creating an infrastructure to do so, I think, should be a mandate within the very high quality universities we have now in Australia. Next slide, please. This is just to give one example of some of the work we're doing. This is a slide depicting the use of small molecule inhibitors to block metastatic cancer. On the left, breast cancer, on the right, prostate cancer. This is one of the companies that I'd founded and financed. Next slide, please. And this slide shows the clinical translation, patients responding to these small molecule inhibitors, reducing the magnitude of the metastatic burden. Next slide, please. And this is a scan showing the resolution of the metastasis using these drugs. Next slide. And this is a clinical trial, with clinical trials that are currently continuing this work. Next slide, please. This is another company which is using a humanized monoclonal antibody to both block and reduce the size of metastasis. Again, preclinical work conducted in a research laboratory. Next slide. And these are the clinical trials that are currently taking place in the US based on the use of this humanized monoclonal antibody. The point of these slides are that this research was funded by federal government funds which facilitate the translation of these discoveries. Next slide, please. This slide is to emphasize just how important the federal government in the US has been in facilitating research. The source of new intellectual property is far and away most importantly deriving from federal government funds, and the facilitation of the transition of intellectual property from the federal government funded research to the universities and or the inventor was mandated as part of a law called the Bayh-Dole in 1980. So the federal government can not only help by facilitating and sponsoring research, but can also facilitate the translation of these discoveries through ensuring the intellectual property is appropriately partitioned with the inventor and small biotech companies that can take it to the next level. This is my last slide, and I'll just summarize it by saying that there is the ability to create a culture in universities where there's a formal understanding of the faculty that there should be a mandate of responsibility to do public good from the discoveries that are made in these academic centres, supported by the federal government and by the taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I am really pleased that you've touched on that point around personality types as well as the culture of institutions, because I think it's going to come up again and again in our conversation here. I also like that you're innovation pillar, which sounds like a big task to take on, but can see why they've given you that role. We'll now hear from Sam Elsom. He's the co-founder and CEO of Seaforest. And as an innovative environmental biotechnology company, Seaforest is one if you haven't heard of already, you will hear of soon. It's leading the way in developing sustainable solutions for reducing methane emissions from livestock and dairy production through the scaled cultivation of red seaweed, Asparagopsis. And I've learnt more about seaweed from Sam than I ever thought I'd know, and I hope you will too. I'll hand it over to Sam.
Thank you very much, Johanna. I too would like to acknowledge the Palawa and Pakana of Lutruwita in Tasmania, the land on which Seaforest operates and the sea country which we farm. And I would also like to pay my respects to Tasmanian elders, past, present. As I guess I'm here as an entrepreneur who's commercializing some very exciting science in the climate technology space. That science, or that foundational science, came from Australia's peak scientific body, the CSIRO, and incredibly exciting at the time. What they were doing was feeding 30 different varieties of seaweed to livestock to see the impact it was going to have on methane emissions. If I could just go to the next slide, please. Whilst incredibly exciting science, there was a key bottleneck, and that was that no one knew how to grow this seaweed, and there was no commercial sort of seaweed aquaculture industry in Australia. So in order to get this solution to scale and for it to have its environmental impact or reach its environmental potential, we had to, or somebody had to, understand how to close the bottleneck of cultivation and supply. And Seaforest is a company that's 5 years old, and we've put together a team of the most remarkable scientists in this space to solve these challenges. So, as well as working with a network of Australian and New Zealand universities to assist us, we're now in a position where we are leading the way in the supply of livestock feed supplements for methane mitigation, and we're working with some amazing Australian beef and dairy companies on that pathway to commercialisation, as well as supporting a number of peer-reviewed academic trials papers that are now in the public domain using our products that continue to show that, as was shown by demonstrated by the CSIRO back in 2016, that the product is both efficacious and has no impact on food safety or animal welfare. We'll go to the next slide, please. And so we're a company that's very much focused on the environmental challenge of climate change, but our goal through the supply of this product we call Seafeed, which is the seaweed-based product, to industry, is to have to provide not only the environmental benefits but tangible commercial benefits, so that our impact can only be realised through collaboration. If I could just go to the next slide. I guess what we're talking about is a gas, and we're targeting is methane. Methane is 28 times the warming impact of regular carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and so it's a really important gas we need to target. It's short-lived, but is very, very potent. And methane from livestock, it represents about 75% of our agricultural emissions. So it's a huge contributor that a lot of people don't really understand. If I could go to the next slide, please. And, you know, what we're looking at is about 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent being emitted by these animals each year. And a world where, you know, not only are we setting some very firm climate targets around the world, with Australia now having a 43% emissions reduction target, but also with Joe Biden's introduction of the methane pledge, a 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. You know, this is getting more and more attention. And also what we're finding is that countries around the world are responding differently to this challenge, with places like the Netherlands. The government is buying back dairy farms and reducing the number of head to address nitrous oxide and methane emissions. And in places like Ireland, where they're actually mandating the reduction in livestock by 2030 in order to tackle it. Here in Australia, we're trying to take a collaborative approach. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. But we still have very ambitious climate targets. So Meat and Livestock Australia is our peak body. They have a meat body. They have a 2030 carbon neutral target. And in Dairy Australia has a 30% reduction by 2030. There's no way they can get there without these feed supplements. So the commercialisation of our science is critical. And if we just go to the next slide, the at scale supply of this product is critical. I just think one of the things I wanted to talk about really quickly, I know we are talking about the commercialization of exciting IP in science, but just thought I'd briefly talk about the way that works, and that is that the way this seaweed works, as bioactives within the seaweed that react with enzymes inside the rumen that prevent the formation of methane and divert that, which would have been expelled by the animal as a gaseous waste product, into energy it uses to grow. So we actually get an increase in productivity as well as the environmental benefit. And then through the cultivation of seaweed, we also have the co-benefits of oxygenating the ocean. I might just slip through the slides and try and get on to another key point that we've made. So that I think is worth making before my time's up. And that is that, you know, on where we're up to in terms of our capacity to supply, we can feed from the assets that we've established in Tasmania. We have an 1,800 hectare marine lease with an option around that for a further 3,500 hectares. We have a land-based site with 660 ponds and the capacity to feed over 5 million head of cows. Where we're challenged at the moment is that's this solution that we've developed comes at a cost. And part of our challenge is how do we incentivize farmers to adopt these products, and how and what role, if any, does the government play in providing those pathways? If they set the 43% emissions reduction target, and there is exciting science coming out of the Australian peak scientific body, the CSIRO, how do we create that roadmap to commercialisation? And I feel, you know, very much like when we started our business, we felt that we weren't going to wait for government to make the changes necessary or the changes that we wanted to see in the world, but rather the private sector drive that. What we're finding now is that without that incentive, and simple incentives such as the access to a carbon credit from the methane or the avoided methane would deliver that outcome. And so, you know, that where we're finding ourselves is we're back engaged with government to try to see how we can kind of remove some of these barriers to commercialisation.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for unpacking some of those bottlenecks and hurdles that you've faced, and you've worked through the bottleneck around developing the supply of seaweed, and but the ones that you still face, and looking at those regulatory hurdles to the uptake of your product is really relevant, and I'm sure something we'll come back to. Our next speaker is Advance GameChanger, Aida Brankovic. And she was recognized in the Global Australian Awards last year. The Global Australian Awards also recognized Richard Pestel many years earlier, I think 2013. But this is a way that we recognize global Australians that are having an impact on the world stage. For Aida, her work in complex algorithms and machine learning has led to groundbreaking contributions in medical imaging, technology, and including a portable head scanner for stroke detection and classification that is affordable and accessible. She is a researcher at CSIRO. So we're hearing a little bit about the contribution of CSIRO from Sam and now also from Aida, and we're really excited to hear your perspective. Over to you, Aida.
Thank you so much, Johanna. It's really absolute pleasure to be part of this discussion. I am Aida Brankovic, research scientist with CSIRO Australian eHealth Research Centre. Just a bit about my background. I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I got my bachelor and master degree from the University of Sarajevo. After short industry experience after graduation, I did my PhD at Politecnico di Milano in Italy, and did also my postdoc there before moving to Australia and starting my second postdoc. So today I will be talking about challenges in research commercialization from the researcher perspective. Before I start, I would like just to acknowledge the Yagera people and pay my respect to their elder past and present. So after moving to Australia for my postdoc, I had the great opportunity to work on research projects that were actually going commercialization pathway. At the University of Queensland, I had an opportunity to work on research that was developing novel technology for brain scanning. And as such, it was devised undergoing traditional commercialization pathway. At the current position with CSIRO, I'm developing the algorithms, and as such, this work is going non-traditional commercialization pathway, where we are basically looking for innovative ways such as health apps to commercialize these algorithms. This slide aims to depict main steps common for both traditional and non-traditional commercialization pathway, starting from answering the research question. Interesting phase is the second phase, development and feasibility, where different game participants are also joining the research, including the investors, advisory boards, and other partners. And this stage includes prototyping, testing, and feasibility documentation. I would like here to pay attention to feasibility documentation, because that is the segment of the commercialization process that can remarkably impact the commercialization process in terms of the time. Now, I would like to talk about challenges. Please, next slide. To talk about challenges within this process, to be more objective and to prevent any personal biases. I also, while preparing this presentation, talked to some other colleagues from different fields who are also undergoing commercialization process within their research. So one of the challenges, especially for Australia, is hardware development. That is because here in Australia, we don't have strong manufacturing industry, and we strongly rely on China and Japan, which add costs and also slows down the development process. Another thing is emerging regulations for software, especially AI and all these things that it brought with itself. Another thing that is kind of obstacle on the way is communication issues that I noticed between the industry partners and researchers, simply different frequencies in which they are thinking. I think the industry and the investor in general are oversimplifying research process in sense that they are perceiving it linearly, though it is not very non-linear process. On another hand, we have researchers that are too much focused on research itself, causing less imperative on manufacturing processes and QMS requirements. Another obstacle is sharing IP irrespectively of the level. It can lead to the breakdown of the project, even breakdown of the team if we look at the lower level. And there is a strong dependence on connection in the research areas. As a young scientist or early career researcher, typically to work out your idea or start the commercialization, probably you would have to look for somebody much more senior, much more powerful with a stronger connection in order to kick off realization of your idea. Otherwise, it is quite likely to fail because you will not have much trust in what you are doing. And in general, there is also a high risk. The people who were like generators of the idea or innovation may also fall off during this path. And lastly, like in general, irrespectively of the career point at which you are, it is quite hard to get the investors. Can we please go to the next slide? So what can be improved? First of all, it would be fantastic if we could improve manufacturing to support the local innovation. If we could ensure that the regulations are keeping pace with the tech development. If we could establish effective collaboration between the researchers and industry or partners by ensuring identification of common goals and transparent communication, meaning that researchers should not be afraid to say when there is a problem, and industry partners should be happy to hear this news as well as good news. If we could organize networking events, what I mean by this is to establish kind of the culture where we will have events for the freshly graduated PhDs or early career researchers, where they will have chance to present their idea, their project. It would be like a mingling event between the investors, industry partners and the researchers, and to provide the trainings and commercialization pathway. CSIRO is doing great in this sense. I mean, we are having trainings on documentation and regulation requirements, which helps a lot in ramping up the commercialization process. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Aida. I really think that your outline there of the challenges and the ways to improve the situation, particularly from the perspective of researchers, is incredibly helpful for this discussion. I also love that you've touched on the point, and we've already heard a bit of this around sharing the different pathways for commercialization, the pathways for commercialization of a medical device or software as a to that for climate tech and for biotechnology. And each of these things, we need to be careful about conflating that all things follow the same pathway. And with that, we come to our final speaker, and I'm so glad Danny Kennedy is with us today. He is an accomplished entrepreneur. He's a renewable energy leader and an advocate for climate action and environmental justice. And as co-founder of Sungevity, and he's a recognized author and speaker, but his work is focused on driving residential solar power adoption, promoting sustainable solutions more broadly. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you very much for having me, and great to be with you, and always enjoy a good Australian event that starts with respect for the Indigenous community. So I should note that I'm on the Chochenyo-speaking band of the Ohlone Indians here in California, in Northern California, across the bay from San Francisco, if you know it. And thank you, Joanna, for the introduction. My current job, and has been for a number of years, is to run something called New Energy Nexus, which is a global organization supporting entrepreneurs to succeed, diverse entrepreneurs driving innovation and trying to build equity into the clean energy transition as it grows around the globe. We started here in California and are very close partners of the state of California, which is, often considered a key economy in the commercialization of new ideas and technologies, and for good reason, obviously. And so have, some intimate experience with that work, at least in the clean energy space. But we run programs to support startups around the globe now, had over 40 such accelerators, incubators in a dozen countries last year. Since I've been here, we've backed about 880 startups and seen thousands of entrepreneurs through our doors in different ways, and put $50 million or more into them at very early stages. So I have some sort of sense of the scope around the globe. And I'm not going to repeat a lot of the very important points that were made individually by the previous speakers, because I think they were all very valid and didn't disagree with any of them. I thought I'd just sort of make some more general overview comments from my perspective. I didn't say, but biographically, I'm strangely an American-born Australian. I was born in California, grew up in Sydney, came here and fell in love, and the rest is history, as they say. But I moved to the States from Sydney in 2006 to start my first company, and then I've been in the renewable space here and around the world since then. And one of the things that stands out in that experience from Australia to California, which has this sort of hallmark of the entrepreneurial state, as I said, is sort of the big picture commitment. You're probably all familiar with the sort of flow chart of the IOOI, the inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact we want in the world. And they're very clear in California. They want to produce game-changing industries. They want to, whether it's produce missiles that can beat the Soviets in the space race and the arms race, which is what was actually the progenitor of Silicon Valley, for those that don't know that history, or whether it's the clean energy economy, for which they entrust, tens of millions of dollars to include a 2045 law that says we'll be carbon neutral in this state, the fifth largest economy in the world by 2045. They have an intent. And I think up the front of that IOOI framework, we should put intent. And Australia has vacillated, I would say at best, around what it wants to be in the world, like in the resource commodity economy, which is dominant in the Australian business world. We like to dig and ship. We don't necessarily like to value add and finish products and take them down a supply chain and value added process step. We are happy to literally ship rocks. The case in point that I think of in my business right now is Australia is the 800-pound gorilla in battery metals. Like it is clear in a way the most important country in the energy transition, in that it produces 60% of the world's lithium. It has a lot of nickel, cobalt, manganese, all the stuff we need to make the energy transition work. With the lithium, the 60%, which is a $200 billion market last couple of years, we get about $1 billion or $2 billion out of that, even though we produce more than half the raw materials. So we've been sort of happy just, being the lucky country endowed with these natural resources, but not intentionally saying we're going to build a supply chain and value chain downstream of that raw material endowment and perfect it and support the entrepreneurs and innovate. And without that intent, you can have all the IP rules and all the venture capital and all the rest that you think you need to put in. And I don't think it's going to go unless we as a nation stand up and say we want to do that. We can recall just in recent lived memory, Turnbull, when he was Prime Minister, launched the Innovation Nation commitments. I think Advance did a bunch of work with that. It lasted 6 months. Have we heard of that initiative since? Do we continue to support entrepreneurs from the top down for the long term? I'm not talking for a 6-month or a 12-month budget cycle. I'm not talking about $1 billion announcement. I'm talking about the nation state putting its treasure and its political will behind the success of the startups that we have aplenty. Because, as everyone said here, Australia has no shortage of great ideas and all the components of an ecosystem that will generate more ideas. I don't like talking about intellectual property because it's not about property and it's not about IP. It's about people and their ideas. And Australia punches above its weight. It's like it's in acting and sport and other things. It does a lot better than other 25 million person population countries in generating great ideas. But what it doesn't do is send them signals that they can succeed in Australia and then beyond. It says, take your great ideas and go offshore, kind of like we dig and ship rocks. We don't polish those products of our amazing public education systems, of our universities and research institutions and all the rest of it. So I think we need that intent. I think, the other thing I'll say, and apologies for running over time, but I think there are 4 inputs we're thinking about when we look at ecosystems. This is how we consider it in California, certainly. There's the ideas. They're important, but they're not what makes commercialization happen. There are people, they make commercialization happen. I think Ada said that commercialization is a non-linear exercise. That's absolutely true. It's a crazy maze. It's a solar coaster in the case of the renewables energy industry. It's a vomit-inducing twister, which any entrepreneur that puts themselves on is going to have to live through and survive. So it's about people. it's about money, obviously. We've got plenty of that in Australia. You got a $5 trillion super pool that's sitting there investing in digging rocks and shipping them. Why aren't you getting your super funds, which you own as members, to invest in early stage entrepreneurs and commercializing their technologies? And then finally, it's demand. And that's one thing we don't have in high order in Australia. We are a small population, that is true. But we sit in Southeast Asia, which is a 700 million person population, going through an economic boom that makes history look, sort of silly compared to almost all other passages. Like those 700 million humans in Indo, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, Thailand, etc., are going through amazing changes for which Australia is very well positioned to supply knowledge services, all sorts of innovations, technology we could make, as well as commodities and raw materials and soft commodities and the like. So we can source the demand if we focus on the people. I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you for that call to action. And in those 4 areas, categorizing it around ideas, people, capital, and then demand. I think we can also touch on a few of the hurdles that have been mentioned to date and really dig into what can be done. We're going to share the result of the poll that you took, the latest poll, which was around who is taking leadership on commercial research commercialization in Australia. And just and if you can't see it there, we haven't put it into a pie chart or something, but it's really around the startups and the entrepreneurs that the audience has seen the biggest role in taking leadership taking place there. Universities coming in second. There we go. Thank you. Universities coming in second. And accelerators, hubs, that ecosystem, the role of ecosystem is incredibly important, as well as private capital. So thank you for responding to that, and we will have a new poll going live shortly. We'll be watching a video now featuring some of more Australian innovators from who have had experiences across different countries and who are noted that Australia has a huge global advantage, and that is in the quality of the research Australia produces. They share their experience and what the challenges are in explaining why many entrepreneurs may choose to take their innovations overseas. With that, let's now watch the video and hear what they have to say, and we can return to a discussion after that.
It's very much with reference to an alignment with key national agenda objectives. And this is in order to address gaps in capabilities. Now, historically, this has been achieved through the import of capability and expertise. But increasingly, both in the UAE and in the region generally, that there is more of a desire and willingness to develop long-term in-country research and commercialisation capability. The UAE has some elements of this approach which I think that Australia, and for that matter many other countries, could benefit from. And there are a few elements. The first one is there is easy and expedient accessibility here to government decision makers. It's a very, very flat structure. Yes, there is a bureaucracy like all governments, but it's not a complicated bureaucracy. It's relatively easy to get to the people who actually make decisions, and they're very receptive to you approaching them. And in some cases, they will actually do the opposite. They will approach industry, they will organise forums or roundtables on a very regular basis, whereby they take the opinion of the private sector, they take the opinion of higher education to see how, as a government, through their ability to legislate, through their ability to regulate, and to make doing business easier, how they can help to smooth out any obstacles that might be there. There is a focus here on building what I would call national champions that have the potential to go global, and there are many instances of that. The rationale for doing this and supporting what they do is that, yes, there is an investment element, but also from a long-term perspective, what they're looking at is knowledge inflow back into the country.
R&D in Australia is around 180,000 researchers. It's about nearly $40 billion invested every year from businesses and universities. Imagine what would it take to build this pipeline. We produce about 3% of all papers globally, yet represent only 0.3% of the world population. We are doing fantastic in terms of research. Now, I think when we talk about commercialization, we need to talk about incentives. What is research? Why are we doing research? So I think the purpose of research is to develop ideas, products and services that then need to go in the hands of people who need them. Commercialization is one way of doing that. Now, universities, which is what I know most, do about 1/3 of all research in Australia. Businesses do half of our R&D in Australia. But the incentives and drivers in universities are very specific. Right? It's about publishing papers and getting your papers cited. Universities have two missions: to do research and to teach students. Commercializing is often seen as a bonus, a good to have, a good thing to do. And what is the purpose? Is it to get money back? So all of this is not really clear. So often it's difficult to extract discoveries out of academic research to put that into the real world because of IP, intellectual property. Universities, national organizations like the CSIRO would like to get a return on the investment. When they invest in research, they'd like to get some return on investment.
I think there's a few things we need to do. One is easy access IP, making sure that everyone knows where the IP is and that people can reach the right people in the right universities. Really hard for businesses to do that. The second thing is making it easy to get IP out, as Rom said, with terms that actually make sense for business. I think that's super important. The third thing, of course, is, getting the KPIs right within the universities, having a focus and a drive for impact. There's definitely more universities that are swinging that way, and they understand that they're going to attract students as well who are more entrepreneurial into the fray, doing it that way as well. Anything that helps the ecosystem is fantastic. I think the government's doing a really good job in terms of beginning to, glue all of those plays together. Universities are increasingly getting incentivized because there's a public push to do this, right? But universities don't know how to do it. Maybe we need to go back to the original concepts of the ARC Centres of Excellence and focus on, perhaps the areas of, say, the National Reconstruction Fund. One of those is defence, which I know a little bit about at the moment in my job, and think about, what do those industries need? What are the problems? Because there's no business without it solving a problem, right? Most research doesn't solve real problems, so it can't be applied. But, actually having a team of people that go out to the universities and pull up all of this IP and actually create some sort of collaboration between universities too. I actually wonder now, after all my dealings with tech transfer officers over the years, that maybe it's actually better taking it out of universities and have something that, sits above the whole ecosystem that might be able to, create really solid, terrific businesses.
One of the big challenges you have is commercialization of that research in Australia.
Absolutely.
To be quite honest, there is very little help. And when we started about 37 years ago, it was very much how do you keep that in Australia. Now, in the Australian context, to try and get government assistance, I think was nigh impossible. Right?
Well, there isn't anything that I'm aware of anyway that covers that what they call the last mile.
Yeah.
And in reality, the last mile is a lot more than a mile, and that is the commercialisation side. I mean, we are fantastic as a country in doing the basic R&D. We are punching well above our weight.
Second to none.
Yeah, but when it comes to actually commercialising that, we are laggards, and there are many reasons for that, but I think one of the big ones is you have such a small market relative to any of the other markets overseas that you could attract. You also do not have a VC market in this country anywhere near what exists overseas. So both of those factors are lacking, and realistically it means that we have to turn to the government. But where the government is not successful, I think, in this area, comes down to they don't have any programs to try and link industry with the research community.
But the importance of that government support, the importance of the government interacting with companies like us, it can't be emphasized, because if you don't, you lose these companies. Now, if it's just a question of losing these companies to overseas, that's a disaster. But more than that is the fact that these companies disappear. Yeah. And with that disappears the innovation.
Not only do you lose that company and all of the people that go with that, but you then have to buy back those products at the inflated price, 10 times, 20 times the price of that original work that was done and paid for by the Australian government.
But what was really refreshing in Singapore was the Economic Development Board. They had the unique task of interacting with companies. They would come in there, and their approach was, what do you want for you to be able to establish yourself here? Not, this is what we have, so you've got to fit in. And that was such a refreshing thing, because you'd go in there, sit down with them, official meeting, government, public servants. They would then, you would then say, for me to exist here, I need A, B, C, D, E. They would then go away and then get universities, the buildings available, facilities available, etc., and bring all those parties together, and then say to you, come and meet these people, meet them individually, tell me what we need to do to try and facilitate this. And then they actually gave us a grant, albeit a very small grant, but it's significant enough for us to be able to start doing something in Singapore. You're trying to do something for your own country. And I think it's incumbent on the government to help you, because if the government doesn't help you, then you're forced to look overseas.
So my co-founder and I have previously revolutionized air conditioning. In fact, we commercialized a product that now has over 60% global market share and has saved over 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions. But now that was just revolutionizing air conditioning. That was taking the worst part and making it much better. This time we are totally throwing away how it's been done for 100 years and restarting. And we're being foolishly patriotic in that we've both repatriated back to Australia to try and make this happen in Australia this time. Because last time, to commercialise our product, the research that we'd done in Australia, we ended up having to move overseas. And in fact, the Canadian government gave us a $26 million incentive if we would move to Canada to commercialise our technology there. One of the big hurdles we have in Australia still is that there's very few grants available to early stage companies. And so the grants tend to have hurdles in them about how many years of operation you must have had or what your annual turnover is, which automatically bars it from entry to a startup. And yet most of the innovation is going to come from startups and entrepreneurs. They're the ones that are going to move this needle far faster than established organizations. I mean, Australia has some great programs for research. So the R&D tax incentive is amazing. Taxes are quite prohibitive though for startups. So as you're ramping up, both personal income tax and also obviously corporate tax. And so in a lot of places, there's a lot of added incentives. So I've been talking to New York State at the moment. They're offering that if we were to move there, there's 0% corporate income tax because we're a climate technology manufacturer. Texas is offering similar things. California is offering similar incentives. And so there's just a different level, and they recognize that different companies can have, an outsized contribution to what the country's goals are. I think COVID has presented a very unique moment in time for this. So there's a lot of people who have repatriated to Australia. And we had this awesome brain regain, but it's going to turn back into a brain drain again as people have to pursue opportunities. And if the opportunities aren't here and they can't get things done here, then they'll go. And so helping entrepreneurs particularly is going to be a way to retain that talent here, which builds the whole ecosystem. Because Australia's ability to manufacture is almost dead. I mean, the grassroots level manufacturing things that you need to do are dying, and there is absolutely no government support for that. There's no government visibility on that. The tool makers and the pattern makers and the foundries and the things that supported automotive, they're just retiring, locking the door and walking away. They're not selling their businesses. There's no new blood coming into it. And unless there's startups that are going to reinvigorate that ecosystem, the ability for Australia to be a manufacturer, to be a manufacturing nation, is going to die with it. The government framed the question in such a way that the risk becomes unpalatable. They can't invest in startups because they've painted it as a loss maker. You know, like it's too risky, and how can they spend government money in that way? And yet they're not really looking at it very holistically. So they're giving money to companies that can prove that they don't need the money. Whereas if you reframe the question and say, we're going to invest long-term in this economy, we're going to retain talent, we're going to build knowledge, we're going to build this ecosystem, because every startup that's trying to build a product goes and gets parts mates, goes and gets stuff machined, goes and gets bits and pieces built and done, which support a wide range of things. So the money that's coming in from the government does end up getting spent in the local economy, even if that company fails. And so the question shouldn't be, will you succeed or not? You know, have you been around long enough to prove that you're a safe bet? The question should be, how are you going to spend this money?
Thank you to all those presenters, Adam, Rom, Natasha, Hari, John, and Sam, for sharing those perspectives and allowing this discussion to include so many diverse entrepreneurs, key thought leaders from across industries. So it's clear that while Australia has a long way to go in getting this right, there's a lot of work underway. And even as we saw, and Rupal mentioned this around the federal budget this week, we have seen that there's a recognition that early stage commercialization is a pain point that needs to be addressed. And so there's an announcement of a $390 million early stage commercialization initiative to prepare homegrown SMEs and startups for future investment through the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund. So we know that this valley of death, this issues that we've touched, each of the speakers have touched on, is alive, and that policymakers are aware of it and working to help bridge that funding valley of death for Australian innovators. But there's still a long way to go. So as we went through that discussion, we've had a lot of questions coming in. Thank you all. I thought I'd kick off with one, if I can go to Richard, please, for the US perspective on this question, and then I'll ask Rupal for a bit more on the Australian context. How do we enable industry-partnered research, or how do we incentivize it, given that the researcher's path to career stability in universities is all about government grants and publications?
Yeah, so it's a great question about how to create within universities a culture that is less risk averse. During the work on the innovation pillar at Jefferson, we created within the university a subsector of the organisation, and that subsector of the organisation had its own physical location, its own building. It had its own lecture series. It had its weekly focus was not so much on Drosophila and basic research, but on the very questions that are being discussed here today. And the lawyers that were involved with that sector of the business were lawyers who were working out how to make it happen, not focused on the risks associated with that venture. So I think there are a number of different approaches, but you're right, the sense of two different cultures, one which is about risk-taking and one which is about risk aversion in the academic setting, has to be reset in a way in which the fundamental responsibility of academic organisations to provide good back to the people who finance them, the taxpayers, by translating these discoveries in a meaningful way rapidly, can be achieved. So part of it really starts with an understanding that there is an obligation, there is accountability to be had. And the accountability is about taking these discoveries and a mandate to bring them to the people who are financing the academic institutions.
Thanks, Richard. Rupal, how does that sit with the university context here in Australia, that accountability for that implementation and commercialization?
Yeah, I mean, Richard brought this up also in his talk, and Ram touched on this, but the kind of core tenets of universities are education and research, but we're starting to see this kind of third pillar emerging, on impact. And that's really great to kind of see in kind of leadership, executive level talks at the University of Sydney. I mean, I think there's a couple ways that we can improve. We need to improve industry researcher engagement and collaboration here. I think there's a couple different ways, problems in that we can address. I mean, one of them is just an administrative barrier. Standardization and IP protocols are so there is kind of a fairness and an understanding of what the intellectual property strategy is, and some of these collaborative agreements need to be addressed. I know that the federal government was talking about this. I kind of don't know where we've netted out on that, but I think that's a major problem. And then, of course, like bureaucracy around the turnaround times of universities. I mean, this is our problem that we really need to solve. I think that there is a huge imperative for universities to better train our researchers on things like how to talk to industry, how do you take a market perspective for in these discussions, and just kind of purely talking about the technology. So I think there needs to be a kind of a big awareness and capacity building driver around these areas, and programs like the CSIRO program, on program, and the university has some programs around this. And I think that kind of like, the basic kind of just ecosystem building is also really important. Getting more industry partners on university campus, getting our researchers out for just people to be able to speak the language a little bit better. And, the Sydney Knowledge Hub is really very much plays in this space. But I think we need to do a better job at kind of ecosystem building, so cultures and personalities are understood a little bit better.
We've had thank you, Rupal and Richard. We've had a number of questions around machine learning, and I'm sure Aida gets asked this a lot in her every day, but how do you see the field of machine learning evolving, and what opportunities and challenges do you see on the horizon for research and commercialization efforts?
Thank you. It's a very broad question. So I think I will try to answer the question through the prism of the healthcare and application in the healthcare. Currently, I mean, it's kind of buzzing term, AI, machine learning. Everybody talks about that. Everybody does that. But the thing is, there's a lot of research on that, in particular for health recently. But to look things realistically, there is very poor uptake. The reason is trustworthiness into the results. And I have to say, because I'm also revising the papers and working as the reviewer for some journals, a lot of research that is trying to be published using the machine learning doesn't meet criteria of fair validation of the approaches that are proposed. So the results can be also misguiding, and hence might not produce the expected results in reality if they would be adopted. So when we talk about like possibilities with machine learning, definitely they are huge. And I think we are using and we are part of machine learning more than we think in our everyday life. So the focus where I think of machine learning, where it's moving, is towards the ethical machine learning, responsible AI, and trustworthiness that in the results that the machine learning algorithms are providing. So that would be, in the nutshell, I guess, answer to this question.
Thanks, Aida. Danny, you mentioned about demand and driving that demand and building supply chains in order to, capture a market that we should really have. Just on a specific one there, how do you start, or who would start building the supply chain for something like lithium in Australia?
I think entrepreneurs, like as we've discussed in all these sectors, there's plenty of great people being well educated and encouraged to do research, and Australia's universities, particularly Western Australia's universities, metallurgical degrees and the like, are spitting out all sorts of great startup ideas. And we could be processing on continent rather than shipping literally rocks, for not just the lithium case, but in the lithium case, there's a very small amount of processing at Kwinana, but there's a lot more opportunity throughout the whole value chain, not just the first step from hard rock to a precursor chemical to the cathode materials that make the battery material. There's the battery cells themselves, which we have a whole lot of great brains thinking about. Companies that you might have seen in the press, like Sakona, Calyx, Novolith, that are looking to come overseas, as has been discussed, the brain drain dynamic, because they don't get these supports and they don't get told they can do this there. This sort of story that Sam from Conroy Tech told of, the incentives elsewhere, but also just like the rejection of Australia being able to make things again. We had a joke when we ran the Supercharge Australia cohort, which was a recent accelerator in lithium, that the slogan should be "Make Australia Make Again." There was a terrible story from one of the entrepreneurs who was building the first gigafactory in Australia of a politician who shall remain nameless here, but went and turned the sod on the factory that had received a couple $1 million from one of these government programs that was sort of a fly-by-night, politically driven, motivated thing. Turned to the CEO and said, mate, we don't actually make things here. Good luck to you, sort of thing. And that's the attitude that has to stop. And instead, this long-term focus that we heard the UAE has developed, which it has in spades. Who would have thunk 50 years ago the Arabian Peninsula desert nomads would be driving, aeronautic innovation with AI and all the genius that they've attracted through their immigration policies and investment in research and education institutions, which Australia's been doing for even longer, drawing immigrants from all around the world, an incredible, diverse, multicultural melting pot with great institutions of learning and research and all the rest of it, except we're not telling our kids to make stuff here. We're saying take it somewhere else. So anyway, the point and answer to the question, it starts with entrepreneurs. Like I said, this is about people. We sort of get stuck on, how do we make IP more successful globally for Australians? It's not about the IP, it's about the people. The path is, as you said, Johanna, a long and winding road at the very least, if not the tortuous maze I described. It's more like a sheep paddock with lots of things coming out. It's not only not non-linear, it's not simple. And supporting people to succeed in that, these hubs, the ecosystem builder roles, the entrepreneur support organizations, incubators, the things that the polling has identified are exactly what Australia needs to do more.
Thanks, Danny. And really, Sam, you're at the cutting edge of a number of these points. So you talked about the regulatory barriers to the demand coming into effect. So you've got the product, but the demand isn't there yet because the regulations haven't built the incentives for people to buy it. But you also mentioned to us around the opportunities in other countries where they do have the intent and they are making these efforts to develop climate tech locally. Tell us about your experience with that and what you're finding on the front line as you make these decisions, what you're weighing up.
Yeah, I think firstly, I agree completely with Danny's comments, that the taking science and to commercialization as a whole host of other challenges, that require a new skill set, and that's that entrepreneurial skill set that's necessary to take, what was a very novel and exciting science of feeding, some seaweeds to cattle, to then turn that into a commercially viable product that's cost effective, that's efficacious, and that passes all of the other, food safety and regulatory approvals has been part of that journey, but does require people with a different set of skills. So I'd just sort of say that's an important step that's outside of sort of academia. That is where, that collaboration is required. And in terms of, as it relates to the technology, I guess that we're commercializing, it's this incentive piece that you spoke of and the need for sort of carbon credits. Now, what's super interesting in Australia, the framework was that the we would wait annually for the appropriate minister to make the announcement around the low emission statement and which methods would be prioritised. So this, when we talk about methodologies, we mean carbon credit methodologies. And there's a requirement under there that you have to be able to reduce at least 1 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in order for that methodology to be recognised. So in order for farmers to have an incentive to adopt the product, you have to show that you can produce 1 million tonnes of enough seaweed, for example, or whatever that technology is, enough to produce 1 million tonnes. Now, how do you get this? You're in this chicken and an egg situation then, where you don't get the support unless you're at a certain scale, and you can't get to scale unless you've got the incentive. So we need to rethink some of these frameworks that are designed to help, but in fact are not helping. And one of the really interesting things about that, as it relates to sort of carbon markets as being the key incentive in this space, is that there's in fact a criteria called additionality and newness. Now, if you were a farmer, for example, that was using our product today and you got to a certain scale, then you would be penalised from being able to access carbon credits when a future methodology arrives, because you've already started. So it's not new, and you've already made a commercial decision. So you didn't need that additional income from the methodology. So therefore, you're creating a perverse incentive in a way that, in fact, is meaning that a lot of farmers in Australia are sitting on their hands. So what we're finding is that this environment as it stands currently is not working, and something needs to be fixed. But what we are finding is that there's a huge amount of interest in these other regions, as you mentioned. So we have started work in the UK, and we are talking to a group in the Netherlands as well. So there is where there is I guess, a different environment, and certainly a keen interest in addressing this issue. Because I think one of the things we need to also acknowledge is that there is only 7 summers left until 2030, and a huge amount of work to do to halve emissions, as the climate experts tell us we need to.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, go.
No, I was going to jump in. Was reminded of a saying that they have up at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is, obviously one of these famous institutions that in California, law and myth has been central in many commercialization tracks of many technologies, starting, unfortunately, with the bomb and the Manhattan Project. But they call it team science, and that this whole game is a team sport. And like what we say, when you get down and dirty with it in the actual market, out of the ivory tower, it's a contact sport, and we've got to sort of treat it like that and get all hands on deck to make things happen. And having a mission, having a vision of what you're driving towards, like Sam was just saying, a climate imperative helps, I think, getting us to win with these technologies too, as well as thinking of it like that.
And I think can I just add on top of what just Sam said, one beautiful sentence, like commercialization is a team sport. Like all parties have to be really united and, handle good and bad things. I think more bad things in the beginning of this process, but the team has to keep trusting team members. And I think that is the key point, I think, for the success.
One benefit that the Australian startup ecosystem has, I think, that as kind of a second mover, that's a second mover advantage after kind of seeing some of the problems that, potentially happen in Silicon Valley and so forth, is that this space feels very collaborative, like it feels very kind of values driven and collaborative. And so I think that, when we're talking about a team sport, that both means kind of within the kind of commercialization team, but also kind of the ecosystem that team operates in. So I think that we're set up really nicely to kind of move this forward.
If I could take off from that point that you've just made, I think there are great ways that Australia can avoid reinventing the wheel. There are systems that work very well in the US that could be adopted. As an example, the City of Hope has a wonderful infrastructure for supporting handoff from faculty discovery to create spin-out companies. And many of those infrastructural support structures are readily and easily mimicked. So if it's working, it's a great time as a second adopter to use these other systems. Similarly, if we take the example of CPRIT, which was an investment made by the state of Texas, the revenue generation from supporting that type of innovation led both to the recruitment of talented individuals and entrepreneurs to Texas, but also the generation of very substantial revenue for the state. Again, an investment in entrepreneurship, but the details of the way in which CPRIP was set up is just beautiful. The amount of thought that went into the way in which that's organised, and it's readily imitable. So I think, as you say, being the second cab off the rank, or a late mover, Rupal, into the space has got certain advantages that Australia can simply cherry pick the best systems that are currently working elsewhere and adopt those. This is not difficult to do.
Absolutely. I think we have heard the importance of ideas and people in making those ideas, turning them into innovation and really running that company to get it off the ground. But we do have a number of questions about intellectual property, and I appreciate Danny's point that it's not everything, but I do think it's one of those things that comes up as some sort of challenge out here, that if we don't fix it, we can't fix anything. So we will take this opportunity to hear from Richard. If I can direct this question to you, please. And this is a question from one of our viewers. Is, in general, we have found a major barrier to be university lawyers or commercialisation teams, different rules for different groups. Universities have chosen to orphan IP rather than letting a startup access and test the opportunity. How can we change this process without having to dob on those that are standing in the way?
Well, I think Rupal mentioned this importance of uniformity of regulations and processes and procedures. And Australia is in a lovely position where there is the spirit of mateship and teamwork in place as a culture, and having a shared and common understanding of how intellectual property is managed within particular environments such as universities is very helpful. But I think secondly, we mentioned briefly the Bayh-Dole Act, and in the US this legislation permits ownership by contractors and others of the inventions that arise from federal government funded research. And it's a relatively straightforward process with a form you fill out, and this can be done and sent by DocuSign. So having simple processes and procedures that are time efficient introduced across the innovation institutions in Australia, I think would be tremendously helpful. And again, I'm not familiar. I should be more familiar with what similar legislation exists in Australia, but certainly the Bayh-Dole Act has been extremely helpful in facilitating not only the development of intellectual property, but the commercialisation process that followed from that, and that's been calculated in tens of trillions of dollars of new funding and new revenue that was generated from those companies from which the intellectual property stemmed.
I just want to add a little bit to that from a University of Sydney perspective. I mean, the way that the university does it here is that if we decide not to move forward in protecting a piece of intellectual property, what we do is we assign it to the inventor, and the inventor can choose to take it forward. So, a lot of when we talk about orphan IP within this university, oftentimes we're talking about something that neither the university wanted to pay to move forward, nor the researcher had the ability or the funding to be able to move that forward. And we're kind of experimenting kind of what we do with those, orphan IPs. So we have a class out of the business school, for instance, that takes business school students, and they get to choose some, the pieces of the provisional patents that we have on the shelf and work on it as a business case for the full semester to be able to, potentially do something with in the future.
That's a fantastic example of how, trying to get it to another market to see what can be done with it to the business school students. That's a really interesting example. I wanted to ask the next question of Sam, and this is, you've been really recognised in a number of different forums for the work around sea forest. How does that publicity and that awareness of what you're doing help the commercialisation of research? And to what extent are you pleased that you've been able to invest your time in that? Would you like to invest more time in publicising what you're doing to really get that momentum to push along what you can do as a company?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's been great to be recognised for the work that we're doing, and I think it is collectively by the Sea Forest team. I mean, the science that we've had to undertake into establishment, the ability to grow and cultivate the seaweed at scale and create products is really a world first. So it is exciting for our team who are in a regional part of Australia to be recognised is great. And there is also an important role in educating the value chain around both the challenges and opportunities of decarbonisation. So we've got an ecosystem where predominantly we need to deliver our product to primary producers, and they need to feed it to their animals. And then, someone down the line and that ends up in a supermarket, and maybe that has a stamp on that product, and the consumer needs to connect with why they might actually prefer to buy that product over another product, for example, and understand the issue around methane emissions. So there is broad value chain education that's required around methane as a gas. We hear a lot about carbon dioxide. So I think I guess we try to use the platform where possible to sort of to echo that message, and also that there is a solution. But I think one of the other opportunities of having the ability to speak in forums like this is that, to reiterate that what we have also is from the CSIRO in this foundational science, a very exciting opportunity in Australia to commercialise this. That's creating regional jobs, and also being able to decarbonise our livestock production ahead of the rest of the world at a very important time where we have, a ticking clock. So whilst it's not something that I lean into comfortably, but I still recognise the important role that it plays, and I just do my part.
Thanks, Sam, and teach us a lot along the way. So it's really valuable. I'm going to turn to the panel. Just a final reflection from each of you, please. Firstly, anything that maybe we've missed, or something that you really struck you in the comments from those who were interviewed. And finally, something that makes you excited for the future. If I can kick off with you, Danny.
So what makes me excited is actually that you're having this conversation. I feel like it's been a long time coming. I think it's fantastic for Advance to be doing this, sort of linking the Aussie diaspora to the home country and driving it. And, I feel like the government that seems to be in thrall in Australia now has a bit more of a sensibility about industrial strategy and what we want as a mission, and the kinds of industries and future industries, the CSIRO and this new net zero authority are going to drive and support. And so having this conversation is a great beginning to a much more transformative outcome in the Australian economy. It's great.
Great. And Aida?
I could not agree more with Danny. I think this is important conversation and important start tackling this problem, and hopefully in the near future having more positive hearings from the people who will be starting new startups and eventually into the startup process.
Thank you. And Sam, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm largely in agreement with Danny and Ada. I think as someone who's had to collaborate with or negotiate with the CSIRO to license some of this technology, I can see both the challenges and opportunities from reviewing the way things work. And these are the forums, and in particular encouraged by our new federal government's more bold climate ambitions. And I think, with that will lead to, a whole load of new innovations that are going to be coming out of our academic institutions in Australia, and being able to sort of smooth that roadmap to commercialisation is what we need if we're to succeed in that challenge.
Rupal.
Yeah, I feel like research commercialization is kind of where the kind of general startup ecosystem was about a decade ago. And I kind of feel, I was part of that ecosystem a decade ago, and I'm feeling that energy right now. So that's really exciting. And I'm also really excited that, because, I'm starting to see some themes emerge, about kind of areas that we can take advantage of, biotech, battery metals, as mentioned, quantum, hydrogen. There are some, we're really kind of starting to put a stake in the ground of what Australia is good at and the direction that we want to move towards. So fantastic to see.
Thank you. Final word to Richard.
Well, I think what to me is really clear is that there's a lot of similarity between the cultures of America and Australia. They're both cultures of innovation. They're both clever countries. They both place value on discovery, and they're both can-do countries. They're essentially meritocracies. And the one difference that I see is the tendency for the risk-taking to be reinforced and supported at a legal and government level. And that's the switch which could turn on an incredible powerhouse of innovation and discovery and new knowledge and value creation for the people of Australia. Can't wait.
Thank you, Richard. Likewise. And thank you to all our panelists today. What an incredible discussion, and the participants for those fantastic questions. Thank you for steering this conversation in such an important way. Coming out of this, we will be sharing with all those online an overview of some of the key points that came out of this discussion, as well as a recording of this. So please do share it with your colleagues or other people that you think might be interested, and provide us some feedback on this event and how you found it. You can see the feedback form there. And thank you again. Join me in thanking our panelists, thanking the recorded presenters as well, and have a good day. Thank you.